Musical theatre, as we know it, has existed for around a century, and so many musicals have now become iconic and are truly beloved, so it takes, in many ways, a very brave director to come along and take a pre-existing piece of musical theatre and change just about everything about it. And sometimes it's a masterpiece, and audiences and critics love it and say this is the best version of this piece that there has ever been, and sometimes people resent it hugely. We're going to take a look at some examples that had both of those reactions today as we look at some of the biggest swings taken by directors in the world of musical revivals. These are the most groundbreaking musical revivals that have been seen on stage. Oh my god, hey, welcome back to my theatre-themed YouTube channel. My name is Mickey Jo and I'm obsessed with all things theatre. I'm an independent theatre critic here on social media, as well as a content creator, and as well as right here on YouTube. You can find me on all the other social media platforms as well. And today I wanted to take a little bit of a historical deep dive into the world of musical theatre revivals, and I was inspired to do this by the current off-Broadway production of the musical Cats. Now, if you don't know, and I recently reviewed this production here on my channel, you can go and check out that video. This is a production that recontextualizes the show to be not even about cats or feline characters whatsoever, but about underground queer ballroom culture in New York. It uses the same material, the same songs, the same lyrics, but it uses a different design and different staging, and a different narrative is created through that. In doing so, the production tells a different story, finds different resonance, and reaches a different community with new meaning, which is exactly what we hope to achieve when we are reviving musicals. And it's those productions I want to talk about today, the ones that took really big swings and changed a lot about the original show. Before I do that, if you are comparatively newer to the world of musical theatre and you're not sure what I mean technically by the word revival, let me explain. So when a play or a musical is written and produced on stage for the first time, we would call that its premiere production, but by and large, when that production then returns, it is often referred to as a revival, or a remounting or a return, depending on context. Those other terms would refer to examples where the original version of the show is brought back pretty much as it was, perhaps with different cast members, but largely with the same director, the same design, it's the same show. An example of this might be when the musical Heathers came back to the Other Palace and came back to At Soho Place in London. A revival, on the other hand, usually refers to a production with a different creative team that take the same existing show, the same script, the same music, the same lyrics, the same characters, the same story, and they create a different production around it. How different is up to them. Sometimes the changes to the staging and to the costumes and to the overall focus and the tone of the piece are minimal, such as when Gypsy has been revived on Broadway with different actresses in the lead role. Those productions have largely been about the casting. On other occasions, the differences are substantial, and these are the ones we're going to talk about today. Now, if you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe to my theatre-themed YouTube channel, and please do comment down below with any other examples I haven't thought of. What is the revival production that you have seen that has been the most different to the original version of the show? Was it Sweeney Todd but set in the 70s? Was it The Little Mermaid but set in an asylum? Tell me all about it in the comments section. For now, here are 10 of the most groundbreaking revivals I would love to tell you about. So I want to start with a recent example of a very old musical, in fact one of the oldest musicals, and a musical that some people call the first ever book musical. I'm talking about Rodgers and Hammerstein's Oklahoma. Now, the reason some people think of this as the first musical is that it was the first to use its lyrics to advance the narrative, specifically because the songs were written for the show and referred specifically to the characters in the show, unlike the Cole Porter musicals and the like that had come before, like in Anything Goes, where the songs are more generic and just speak about like love and friendship without referring specifically to its own characters, and they don't advance the plot so much as riff on the scene that has just led into the song. Oklahoma was also groundbreaking in the way that it used music, script, and dance, all three as storytelling tools to tell one overall story. But who could have foreseen when this musical hit Broadway decades ago for the first time that it would one day be considered groundbreaking all over again? I am speaking of the divisive Broadway revival from director Daniel Fish, which was the recipient of the 2019 Tony Award for Best Revival of a Musical, evidencing much critical success, but audiences were not wholeheartedly convinced. This really split opinion in a way that we don't often see. And that's because the quaint, classic, romanticized version of the show that audiences remembered and first fell in love with was absent in this production. Instead, Daniel Fish staged the thing in this immersive community hall familiar layout with modern dress and a modern sensibility. He used onstage cameras, not the last time you'll hear about those in this video, to project images onto the rear wall, and he made particularly expressive use of lighting in order to simulate unease and tension and discomfort in the audience. For one thing, when the show began, the house lights didn't go down. We remained in total light for a prolonged amount of time. Then when the house lights did go down, everything was engulfed in this green wash. Later in the show, the audience were plunged into total darkness for a prolonged amount of time, allowing them to focus solely on the words being said on stage in hushed tones. And those were just the most obvious creative decisions. There were also changes to the show's music and orchestrations. The dream ballet that normally takes place at the end of Act 1 instead took place at the start of the second act and was reconceived for a solo dancer performing this contemporary interpretive dance. Many of the show's characterizations had also subtly shifted, including that of the show's traditional antagonist, Judd Fry. Now, Judd is normally painted as this villain who is pursuing our heroine Laurie against her wishes. In Daniel Fish's interpretation of the show, Judd is an overtly sympathetic character who is not killed by Curly when he first tries to murder him at his wedding, but instead shot in cold blood, a crime which is covered up immediately in a hugely uncomfortable sham trial. In the story of a community on the verge of joining the Union and becoming a brand new state, this instead takes a look at America now and asks audiences difficult questions about the morality of this show and of the nation. And while many people delighted in this radical reinterpretation, affectionately referring to it as Sexy Oklahoma for being more passionate, being more exciting and speaking more to a contemporary audience than, you know, the more classic version of the show, there were also a great many theatregoers who resented it, who really hated it. This show had a lot of people walking out of it in protest, and that's not just in the US, it happened in the UK as well. I have reviewed the show twice here on my channel because I saw it both at the Young Vic in a more immersive production, and then again when it transferred to the West End in the Wyndham's Theatre in a more traditional proscenium staging, where I enjoyed the thing a little better. And interestingly enough, even if it didn't win over all of its audiences, the UK production also won the Laurence Olivier Award in 2023 for Best Revival of a Musical. But not every revival I'm going to tell you about today has been considered controversial. Some of them have been hugely successful, and none more so than Chicago. Now, the uninitiated among you may not have even realized that this production, currently running on Broadway, was actually a revival, but the original 1975 production of Chicago, directed by Bob Fosse and with a score by John Kander and Fred Ebb, closed after just over 2 years. And it wasn't until 1996 that Chicago, as we now know it, would first appear. But this production was never originally intended for Broadway. This was, in fact, a semi-staged concert presentation as part of the New York City Center Encores series, a series that still continues today, with a mission to bring the unheard scores of yesteryear to modern audiences. And many Broadway productions have transferred from Encores since, including the current running Broadway transfer, Once Upon a Mattress, starring Sutton Foster at the Hudson Theatre in New York. Also, the recent Tony Award-winning revival of Parade, also Into the Woods, and many more besides. And in their upcoming series, Encores will be producing concert versions of Ragtime and Urinetown, as well as other shows. But back to Chicago, which was staged there in the mid-90s, directed by Walter Bobby and choreographed by Anne Reinking, a muse of Bob Fosse's, in his style. Anne also starred in that production as Roxy Hart, and when Barry and Fran Weissler, producers, went to go and see the show, they noticed something that audiences had also picked up on, as well as critics, which was that the show worked surprisingly well in that minimalist, stripped-back setting. Those producers were also very canny and observed that this could be a hugely profitable production for them. Sure enough, it transferred to Broadway, where it became the fastest musical in Broadway history to recoup its initial investment and start making profit. And it's still running today at the Ambassador Theatre in New York, where it has recently become Broadway's longest-running production to still be open after the closure of the Phantom of the Opera. But we absolutely cannot talk about groundbreaking revivals without talking about this production of Chicago. It's hugely interesting that you can really see its roots with this minimalist staging. The reason why this works for the show is because it centers the band on stage, which is something is worth saying that a lot of people enjoy increasingly in musical theatre, and we're seeing more and more more of. But the other thing that this production brings to the forefront with its sleek black costuming and its minimal design is the Fosse-style choreography, which has always been one of its greatest assets. In fact, when you think of Chicago, the two things most likely to come to mind are the fantastic songs by Kander and Ebb and the Fosse style of choreography. Pow, pow. This production also won the Tony Award for Best Revival of a Musical, and at the time set another record. It won the most Tony Awards of any revival in musical history. And over the years, it's also become known for its celebrity casting approach, which we've started to see in other productions as well, but Chicago has stayed relevant and brought in new audiences to the theatre by casting people from unexpected places. Some people from other parts of the entertainment industry, with singers and reality TV stars, but also sports people. The show has recently done fantastic business at the box office, bringing in RuPaul's Drag Race winner Jinx Monsoon, as well as Vanderpump Rules star Ariana Madix. I saw both of them in the show. They were both fantastic, very well cast. And it's appropriate for a show like Chicago that is all about this celebrity fascination to do casting like that. It's worth saying that's probably another component of why the mid-90s production was more successful than the 1970s original. Society had very much changed by the time that Chicago came back to Broadway. And as the years go on, we only become more and more fascinated with celebrity culture. It's a shame, though, that Fosse, one of theatre's most influential directors and choreographers, wouldn't live long enough to see this enormous success for Chicago. And interestingly enough, it's not the only one of his shows that was revived in a groundbreaking way. Let's talk next about Pippin. Now, I'm a huge fan of the musical Pippin. I think it's one of the great underrated musical theatre scores. It features a score by Stephen Schwartz, a book by Roger O'Herson, and it was originally directed on Broadway by Bob Fosse. This was in the early 1970s, and it starred John Rubinstein as the title character of Pippin and Ben Vereen as the enigmatic leading player who commanded a huge amount of charisma and showmanship. Now, if Pippin hasn't gone on to have the same kind of huge success as the likes of Chicago and Cabaret, also directed by Fosse, it's largely because of its plot. It's something of an abstract piece that follows the story of a young medieval prince looking to find his way in the world and trying his hand at different pursuits in order to gain complete self-actualizing fulfillment, as guided by a troupe of players who are telling his story, led by the leading player. This eventually gives way to some dark revelations, and I could speak at length about the secret meaning beneath Pippin, but there are a lot of different ways you can interpret this show, and as such, it has been revived in many different fashions over the years, and more so than almost any other musical that has been produced on stage, there have been a lot of concept revivals of Pippin. For example, the first time I ever saw the show, it was in 2012, I think, at the Menier Chocolate Factory in London, where they were reviving Pippin within the concept of a computer game. In this production, a young Harry Heppel was guided through different levels of a computer game by Matt Rawle, and what they did here is they latched onto this idea of Pippin's sort of different chapters within the original structure of the show, him trying his hand first at war, then at love, then at politics, reconceiving these as different levels that he had to navigate in order to reach a final boss. We learn an important lesson about musical theatre revivals here, that you can recontextualize them and reframe them using only really one aspect from the original production. A later London run that transferred to the Charing Cross Theatre in London latched onto Pippin's idea about wanting to find himself amidst, medieval war, and decided to recontextualize it with this 60s hippie flower power era with the backdrop of the Vietnam War, like the musical Hair. But it was director Diane Paulus who saw a connection between this troupe of players presenting a story in Pippin, encouraging him to pursue this one final brilliant act, and the world of the circus. This gave us the 2013 Broadway revival of the show as reconceived within the world of a circus and gymnastics and acrobatics, and this colourful troupe of players leading Pippin through his life. And when you recontextualize a show like this, that is to take it from its original setting and put it into a different one. This show was never written to be set within a circus. All you really need is a few really great connections in order to justify the thing. This is something that the ballroom production of Cats also does quite well, incidentally. And it was this idea of Pippin being encouraged to perform this final act that really made it work within this setting. But not only that, there were a couple of other key creative decisions that lent themselves very well to this interpretation. One of those was the character of Bertha, Pippin's grandmother, who in the original production was a sedentary character who would sit and sing to him this song about life and the wisdom that she had learned through old age, and would sing along with the audience as well. It's a charming number, and the comedy arises from this elderly woman talking openly about the joys of lust and sex. But in Diane Paulus's revival, Bertha, as originally played by Andrea Martin, decides to once again find the joy and vivacity of life and its experiences for herself as she ascends to the top of the stage on a trapeze with a circus partner. Andrea Martin won the Tony Award for Best Featured Actress in a Musical for her troubles. But she was not the only Tony Award-winning performer in that revival, because here's the other substantial change that they made. The role of the leading player, originally played by Ben Vereen, as you will remember, was reconceived for a female performer. Patina Miller played the role and won a Tony Award for her energizing and nefarious performance. Patina's authoritative and commanding take on the leading player allowed her to strike all the same intimidating notes that Ben Vereen had done, but afforded her a new seductiveness at the same time. This was an example of a director looking at material and seeing possibilities with something being changed. But we can't talk about gender swapping in musical theatre revivals without tipping our hats to this next show. I'm talking, of course, about the Stephen Sondheim scored musical Company. Now, this, having only happened a few years ago, is still pretty fresh in people's minds, but the story goes like this. Director Marianne Elliott, who had previously brought Warhorse and The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime to the stage for the National Theatre, had the idea to revive Stephen Sondheim and George Furth's Company with a female protagonist. When it first premiered in 1970, this show had been about Bobby, a bachelor who was turning 35 and was being adamantly encouraged by all of his friends to settle down and finally get married. It's very much a product of its time, and it made more sense to audiences in the 1970s. Much of the show's material also reflects that culture, and directors who revive the piece now have to make the decision whether to keep it situated within its original 1970s setting or to modernize it and contend with the fact that a lot of the themes of the piece aren't as relevant or as applicable to a modern audience. But Marianne Elliott had a different idea. Make the thing modern, but make it mean something to a modern audience in different ways. While a man in his mid-30s may not experience the same pressure to get married today, a woman in her mid-30s deals with the weight of that expectation constantly. So Bobby with a Y became Bobby with an IE and was played by Rosalie Craig. But that change also catalyzed a whole series of changes throughout the rest of the production and its casting. For example, Bobby has 3 girlfriends, Marta, April and Kathy, who suddenly became 3 boyfriends. And there were more inspired ideas to come, because one of the other biggest switches about this production is to have the character of Amy, who sings the iconic fast-paced song brackets not getting married today, instead become Jamie, with this being about a neurotic groom on the day of his same-sex wedding. Talk about speaking to modern audiences. And it wasn't simply a case of all the men becoming women and all the women becoming men. Some couples remained as they were. For example, Joanne, played by Patti LuPone in this revival, and her husband Larry, all of which showed a very careful attention to detail from director Marianne Elliott. She really went through this production and found the parts of it that made sense in this new context and the parts of it that didn't. And Sondheim himself, who was never effervescent with praise simply for the sake of it, especially about his own productions, said the whole thing was totally thrilling. This production originally ran at the Gielgud Theatre in the West End, where it won the Olivier Award for Best Revival of a Musical, before transferring to Broadway, where it won the Tony Award in the same category. But it wasn't the production of Company I originally wanted to tell you about. It's just the one that everyone remembers. I want us to look back to 2006, when director John Doyle brought Company to the Broadway stage in a completely different way. This was one of the earliest examples of actor-musicianship in a show. That means the actors who are performing these characters on stage, playing these roles, also accompany themselves using instruments. Doyle had already employed this technique in a previous Broadway revival of Sweeney Todd, starring Michael Cerveris and Patti LuPone, and we've seen it a whole lot since, often used by other directors. And sometimes it can be as simple as the actors who are no longer immediately in the playing space going to the side and then playing instruments to support the action that is happening on stage. But in this production of Company, the instruments were very much a part of the creative process. One example of this was the song performed by Bobby's 3 girlfriends, You Could Drive a Person Crazy. Previously, they would harmonize with these high-pitched notes, singing do-do-do-do, do-do-do-do, do-do-do-do-do-do, and in this production they instead played the same notes on saxophones. And that wasn't the only meaningful use of instrumentation. In the show, Bobby is constantly being hounded by his friends to make a decision and to move in a certain romantic direction, and it's only at the end of the piece when he's singing the song Being Alive that it all finally clicks for him. And in this production, he is one of the only characters on stage not to play any kind of an instrument until he sings Being Alive, when he accompanies himself meaningfully and profoundly on the piano, finally singing to a tune of his own creation. And this production, not unlike Walter Bobby's version of Chicago, used very monochromatic black and white costuming and was very stripped back and implied the existence of a birthday cake that we never really saw, had actors sitting on seats around the edge of the playing space, like the revival of Chicago. It's fun to see the way that these revivals may have influenced and impacted each other, actually. If it wasn't already clear, I loved this production and it was professionally recorded, so you can check it out for yourselves. Oh, and it also won the 2007 Tony Award for Best Revival of a Musical. Now, when I told you about Chicago, this was an example of a revival that was different by necessity because of the theatre where it originated. And it's not the only example of that on my list, because we're heading back to London now for one of my favourite theatres in the entire world, and you can find it in the middle of Regent's Park. I am talking, of course, about Regent's Park Open Air Theatre, this beautiful exposed auditorium that, because of the nature of the space, often has to reinvent musicals which are performed there. And I have two examples for this list. The first being Timothy Sheeder's hugely successful production of Jesus Christ Superstar. Now, Timothy Sheeder, as a director, is no stranger to reinvention when it comes to musical theatre. I saw his production of Into the Woods there in 2010, my favourite musical of all time, and this was, I believe, the first time in the show's history that it was ever being staged outdoors, but it also incorporated a very bohemian aesthetic in its design by Sutra Gilmore. Years later, he would direct a production of Ragtime at the theatre, starring Rosalie Craig, interestingly enough, that would ultimately switch between period and contemporary American aesthetics, a potentially heavy-handed way of drawing comparisons between the racism and the prejudice depicted within turn-of-the-century, early 20th century America and America now, as well as acknowledging the journey that the country had made. This, I believe, was when Obama was in office, but it's his production of Andrew Lloyd Webber and Tim Rice's groundbreaking rock opera Jesus Christ Superstar that I want to tell you about, because a lot of these other examples made changes in very obvious ways. They updated the shows to look completely different, or they changed things about the characters, and this one was a slightly subtler shift. But much like some of the other revivals that we've talked about and will talk about, it paid careful attention to its source material when it made its changes. So Jesus Christ Superstar was already this groundbreaking show in its own right, portraying the final days of Jesus' life from the perspective of Judas, and controversially asserting Judas's opinion that Jesus was not necessarily divine, but an inspiring figure nonetheless. In the years since, the controversy surrounding the original production has mellowed somewhat, and what audiences remember is the iconic rock opera score that also was released as a concept album at the same time, helping to popularize it beyond the theatrical community. So when Timothy Sheeder was staging it at Regent's Park Open Air Theatre, it was the music of the whole thing that he focused on, and it became Jesus Christ Superstar as a gig. Jesus became a musician, preaching from a microphone at a stand with an electroacoustic guitar. In fact, he accompanies himself as he performs Gethsemane. Perhaps Sheeder looked at Jesus Christ, this extraordinary figure to bring to the stage, and asked himself questions about this character's most basic facets. Who is this man? He's someone who preaches, who influences enormous groups of people. How is he able to do that in the musical? It's through his music, and so he's reconceived here as a musician. Judas, meanwhile, is one of his many roadies, one of the crew members following him around, and the villainous priests have this kind of a heavy metal aesthetic. King Herod is a little familiar of glam rock, and the production was a huge success. Again, it won the Olivier Award for Best Revival of a Musical. It transferred to the Barbican Theatre in London, it's toured the UK, it's toured the US, and a huge part of its success, I think, is that while it has this new concept around it with this whole gig aesthetic, it's not so heavy-handed that it gets in the way of audiences who want to enjoy the show on their own more traditional terms. It still looks and sounds and feels like Jesus Christ Superstar and doesn't represent as much of a departure from the original show as productions like Oklahoma did. At the same time, it's also proved successful enough in the UK to continue being remounted and for people to begin to associate the show with that specific production. Flash forward a few years later at the same venue, Regent's Park Open Air Theatre, and while Timothy Sheeder at the time was still the artistic director, he didn't direct this next one personally. That would be the task of Tony Award-winning Six composer and director Lucy Moss, who this time would be directing a revival of Legally Blonde. Legally Blonde, celebrated by many, including myself, as one of the all-time greatest movie-to-stage musical adaptations. The original 2007 Broadway production has become beloved, largely because of its professional recording on MTV, and many productions that have followed have not strayed too far from this original version. There's also something to be said for musicals based on films having to retain a lot of similarity to that original version, to what feels familiar. Shows like The Addams Family are also burdened by this same challenge. As innovative and original as a creative team may want to be, audiences going to see The Addams Family still expect those characters to look a certain way. It's the same way with Disney musicals. But something about Legally Blonde being produced at Regent's Park Open Air Theatre, a theatre which, even when it did musicals, didn't tend to do particularly contemporary ones, invited the opportunity for change. And there were plenty of changes about this production. It was brought up to date a little bit, not that the original felt too dated, but it was conspicuously more modern with a lot of Gen Z references, the whole show beginning with a TikTok filming. This production was considerably less naturalistic in its uses of block color for costuming, rather than just letting them all feel like real people. Everyone wore colors sort of designating them to different walks of life. Everyone wearing sort of like muted brown earthy tones at Harvard, and Paulette and all of the staff at her hair salon all wearing this bright neon orange. Elle and her cohorts at Delta Nu, of course, all being in hot pink, as was the entire set. One of the most polarizing creative choices, the dogs in this production, that is Elle's dog Bruiser and Paulette's dog Rufus, were both played by human performers in dog costumes. It was a very campy, tongue-in-cheek choice I personally enjoyed very much, but a lot of people just couldn't get past that. But it was the casting that made this production particularly exciting. Courtney Bowman, a plus-size actress of colour, was cast in the role of Elle Woods, who up until that point had only ever really been played by thin white actresses, thin white blonde actresses usually. And yet Lucy Moss and this creative team were smart enough to realise that Elle, within the context of the script and the material, was only ever described as a blonde woman with an extraordinary amount of charm and guile, all of which Courtney Bowman commanded exceptionally. The production also saw several other protagonists, including Emmett and Warner and Vivian, portrayed by performers of colour, and was hugely trans and non-binary inclusive in its casting. And in line with this more modern sensibility, a handful of the lyrics, specifically ones making reference to different racial stereotypes, were also changed. With this revival, it was very interesting to see how quickly a show, even a modern show, can become dated, and also how meaningful it can be to different communities to have them reflected in different types of stories, which is also exactly what this next production did. And while this one may have only been a nominee for the Tony Award for Best Revival of a Musical, it did win plenty of hearts. I am talking about the Deaf West production of Spring Awakening. Now, once again, Spring Awakening was already considered groundbreaking when it first came to Broadway in 2006. It had this very young, very edgy energy. It was a pop rock musical scored by Duncan Sheik about these tortured adolescents coming to terms with their own sexual awakenings in a very repressed European society. In many ways, it was the first show since Rent to really galvanize a generation of theatregoers so passionately. But when it closed on Broadway a few years later, that wouldn't be the end of Spring Awakening's Broadway story, thanks to a theatre company from the west coast of America called Deaf West. And I want to read you exactly what this says here because I could not put it better. Established in 1991, Deaf West Theatre engages artists and audiences in unparalleled theatre experiences inspired by deaf culture and the expressive power of sign language. Committed to innovation, collaboration and training, Deaf West Theatre is the artistic bridge between the deaf and hearing worlds. And that's exactly what this production, directed by Michael Arden, would do. It would pair deaf and hearing actors in the same roles, using both English and American Sign Language in order to articulate the feelings of those characters. What does this have to do with Spring Awakening, you may be wondering? Well, there are huge themes within this show about the young characters in the show not being appropriately listened to by the older voices, by the educators, by those responsible, the adults within their community. This angsty futility of their proclamations is even more evident in a show where they are desperately trying to express themselves using sign language. And the production also had an interesting connection to the original, with two of the original cast members, Krista Rodriguez and Andy Mientus, returning to their roles. In fact, I believe the whole thing may have been based around an idea of Andy Mientus's, because his husband is Michael Arden, who directed it. Now, the show transferred to the Brooks Atkinson Theatre on Broadway in late 2015, and it closed in 2016. It didn't win the Tony Award for Best Revival of a Musical, but the important and exciting work of Deaf West goes on. In fact, they are producing more shows very soon. They have an upcoming production of American Idiot. If you are anywhere near to them or fancy traveling to go and see this work, go and check it out. I just really wanted to include that example in this list because though I didn't get a chance to see it for myself, which I'm very sad about, I know that it meant a huge amount to a lot of people, both in and out of the deaf and hard of hearing community. And I also think it's important to think of productions like that when we talk about groundbreaking revivals. Groundbreaking is both like tearing the whole thing apart and doing it in a completely different way, and it's also, you know, breaking open that ceiling, breaking open those doors and allowing new performers and sort of disenfranchised performers and historically marginalized performers, often who haven't been allowed on Broadway stages and on these vast spaces, to come in and help tell those stories and to be able to articulate their own stories through that material. Next up, another show that became newly diverse in its casting when it had a major UK revival in 2023. I'm talking about the classic musical comedy Guys and Dolls, which was revived many times on Broadway, but it was this production last year at the Bridge Theatre that proved the most groundbreaking. Now, director Nicholas Heitner was a former artistic director of the National Theatre, and when he left that venue, along with executive director Nick Starr, they opened the Bridge Theatre a little further down London's South Bank. And this was deliberately created to be a malleable space that could have a couple of different theatrical configurations, including the possibility for promenade productions with the audience completely immersed in the action. And Guys and Dolls was not the first time that they deployed this technique. They had already done this with two different Shakespearean productions, Julius Caesar and A Midsummer Night's Dream. But Guys and Dolls has certainly proved the most popular and represented the first time where this venue hosted an open-ended run rather than the previous limited run strategy that it had been utilizing. Because this production, directed by Nicholas Heitner, choreographed by Dame Arlene Phillips, and designed by Bunny Christie, has standing audiences as well as sitting audiences fully immersed in the streets of Manhattan as the musical comedy Guys and Dolls plays out amongst them. Rather than having one traditional stage, the action takes place over these moving levels of platforms that create this adaptive stage that is constantly changing shape, and the audience moves around amongst that. They also get sprayed with water, they get brought on stage, they get handed props, they get spoken to by other cast members. When Sky Masterson and Sarah Brown go together to Havana, we're all in Havana, twirling things, dancing around. And this very contemporary staging of the show was also apparent in Heitner's direction, and in the comedic tone, and in the characterization of some of the performances, particularly that of Marisha Wallace as Miss Adelaide. This is one of the most iconic roles for a character actress in musical theatre, and this, though not the first time the role was played by an actress of colour, was perhaps the first time it happened in such a major production. Now, the beauty of this one is that while the show finds this modern sensibility and humour, it is still overtly classic. It still takes place during the same time period. It still has classic costuming, and the score still sounds the same. So, you know, the staging idea of it and the immersive audience experience appeals to a new, younger generation, but the classic feel of the thing still makes more traditional theatregoers happy. So everybody wins with Guys and Dolls at the Bridge. And if rumours are to be believed, there is still the possibility that this production could transfer somewhere to New York, but not necessarily Broadway. That's because the complex staging of this production doesn't really lend itself to any Broadway house, even the Circle in the Square. The standing audiences would need to be part of this lower space so that platforms could rise up without obstructing the sightlines of the people who are sitting around them. And I've heard rumours in turn that this production was going to the Broadway Theatre when Here Lies Love closed, that it was going to the Perelman Performing Arts Centre where Cats is currently performing, that it's going to be produced in a boat on the Hudson River. As it stands, none of these have been confirmed. What we do know is that the London run is set to come to an end early next year. So if you haven't yet seen Guys and Dolls in the UK, I urge you to do so. It's a wonderful production, and it likely would have swept the Olivier Awards if it wasn't in the same year as this next revival. I'm talking about the imminently Broadway-bound, multi-award-winning revival of Sunset Boulevard, directed by Jamie Lloyd. Now, I've talked extensively about this production here on YouTube. You can go and watch my many videos about it, including my full, long review of the show and all of the different choices that it made in service of the text. But the short story here is that when this got announced, we knew it was going to be very different. We knew because Jamie Lloyd, who has directed many musicals at this point in his career, which were becoming more and more innovative and creative since he directed Spelling Bee at the Donmar, and then Urinetown, and then Assassins at the Menier, and then Evita at Regent's Park, which was beginning to, you know, show familiarity to what Sunset Boulevard would become, and allegedly the first time he pitched a role to Nicole Scherzinger. In the years since his last musical, Jamie Lloyd's style had become even more specific and threadbare, using microphones, using very minimal costuming, using these very desaturated aesthetics, all encouraging audiences to focus solely on the text and on the words and on these acting performances and the connection between these characters. So when he was announced as the director of a brand new West End production and Nicole Scherzinger was announced as its star, we knew this was not going to be Sunset Boulevard as we know it. The original production of Sunset Boulevard, first produced on stage in the 90s with Patti LuPone in London, and then controversially Patti LuPone not on Broadway, but instead Glenn Close on Broadway, who won the Tony Award, and the show won the Tony Award. This was an adaptation of the classic film, the tragic story of the faded silent screen star Norma Desmond, and the original production was very lavish. There was a car on stage, there was an enormous staircase, there were these extravagant costumes and turbans and a funeral for a monkey. Jamie Lloyd's production, unsurprisingly, had none of that. Instead, along with the blood and the microphones that he loves to use, he added a new tool to his arsenal: onstage cameras. Which isn't to say that he was the first director to do so. We've already heard of another example of this in Oklahoma, which preceded Sunset Boulevard, and in fact, Ivo Van Hove is probably the director most closely associated with popularizing the use of cameras on stage, and sometimes off stage as well. Because this production of Sunset Boulevard, which deploys a giant screen that the cameras convey a live feed to, doesn't just film things on stage. It also uses the backstage, the wing space, and even outside the front of the theatre, with leading man Tom Francis, who won an Olivier Award for his performance, performing the first song of the second act, the title song Sunset Boulevard, while walking from his dressing room around the backstage space, out of the stage door, around the block, back into the venue and back onto the stage to huge applause. And truthfully, this production was a little bit divisive as well. Not everyone was convinced by this new version of Sunset. To my mind, the reason why this works is because the story is inherently cinematic. It's being told from the perspective of a Hollywood screenwriter, so it makes sense that in telling us this story, he would relate it via screens. It's also about Norma Desmond, who is trapped within the screen in her own mind. She is literally trapped in the cinema screen and she can't live a real life outside of that. But the show's huge multi-award winning success in the UK does not guarantee it will have the same success on Broadway. It is going to be opening in October of this year, and I am hugely intrigued about how it is going to be received. Needless to say, I will be reporting on its critical response when it arrives at the St James Theatre on Broadway, so make sure you watch this space. Now is a great time to make sure you're subscribed to my theatre-themed YouTube channel with the notifications turned on so you don't miss those videos when they come. But ultimately, Sunset Boulevard has to make this list. It has a completely different aesthetic to productions that came before, and Nicole Scherzinger was decently different casting as well. Many people said that she was too young to play the role, but she really demonstrated with her incredibly vulnerable, ferocious, animalistic, and stratospheric high-belting performance that she innately understood the challenges and the complexities of this character. But as I mentioned before, West End success does not guarantee the same reception on Broadway, a lesson recently learned by another revival, Rebecca Frecknell's production of Cabaret. When it opened on Broadway earlier this year with Eddie Redmayne and Gayle Rankin, it was not as beloved by the critics, nor by the Tony Awards. And one of the largest reasons for that is the still lingering shadow of the previous revival, and that's the one I want to tell you about next. That's the one that makes this list for being utterly groundbreaking. Frecknell's was too, but it very much walked through a door opened by this last one. I'm talking about Sam Mendes' revival of Cabaret, originally at the Donmar Warehouse and very successful on Broadway. So Cabaret was originally produced on Broadway and in the UK in the 1960s. It was revived in both places in the 1980s. There was also a film adaptation starring Liza Minnelli, but it was this 90s revival that I think would be the most impactful in the show's history. Which is fascinating to say that it began its life at the very intimate and very small Donmar Warehouse in London, considered by some to be part of the West End, others to be an off-West End venue. This was directed by Sam Mendes, and it starred Jane Horrocks as Sally Bowles and Alan Cumming as the MC. She would not stay with the production when it transferred to Broadway. Natasha Richardson would play the role instead, but Alan Cumming would stay with the show and would return when the production was remounted years later. Now, Alan Cumming's award-winning portrayal of the role would prove hugely memorable for many theatregoers, and for a lot of people, he is still the only person who could possibly play the MC. I see that comment all the time. Even though Joel Grey originated the role, it's Alan Cumming who a lot of people think is innately connected to that character. And that's quite appropriate to this conversation because many of the most groundbreaking changes around this particular production are linked to the character of the MC. He is more overtly sexualized in this production. He is more overtly queer in this production. We can have a conversation about the lingering queer undertones from the original writing of the character. This version also featured a harrowing ending in which he removed his outerwear to reveal that he, as the MC, was also a victim of the Holocaust for reasons emblazoned on his inmate uniform. And it was this production, I believe, that was also the forerunner to Rebecca Frecknell's vision for the show to be this immersive Kit Kat Club space, because I do think it was Sam Mendes' revival that first reconceived the auditorium as the Kit Kat Club itself, with the orchestra being featured above the stage and with cabaret seating. It's interesting whenever a revival like Chicago is able to usurp the memory of the original production and be the thing that audiences most closely visualize when they think about that show as a property. And I think this revival of Cabaret, certainly for American theatregoers and for Broadway audiences, has done that. And of course, it also won the Outer Critics Circle Award, the Drama Desk, and the Tony Award for Best Revival of a Musical. So those are, to my mind, the 10 most groundbreaking revivals in musical theatre history. But of course, that is just my opinion, and I want to know more about what you think. Which productions have you seen or do you know about that made huge changes to the original versions of the show? What shows deserve to be added to this list? Comment down below with all of your thoughts and feelings, as well as your thoughts about the productions listed in this video, especially if you saw them either in the UK or the US. And thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed this deep dive into theatre history. Stay tuned for more videos about theatre revivals and theatre history coming very soon to my channel. I hope that everyone is staying safe and that you have a stagey day.
For 10 more seconds, I'm MickeyJoTheatre. Oh my god, hey, thanks for watching, have a stagey day. Subscribe!